Welcome back to Common Language Podcast, where we break down today's complex policy issues into easy to understand ideas to help curious minds stay informed and empowered.
Today is Friday, March 20th, and we'll be covering the history of voter ID laws, voter suppression, and voting rights, highlighting the SAVE Act and how the current administration is working to advance legislation, but why its outlook isn't super bright.
Yeah, and I think this is such an important topic to be talking about right now because one, it's clearly this administration's top priority. And two, it's going to have impacts on our election system. And that's particularly important because, as we've been talking about a lot on this podcast, it is election season. There is midterms elections this year. So it's an opportune time to talk about our election systems and how that impacts our democracy.
Totally. So let's get right into it. Our vocab section for this week includes the 15th Amendment, voter ID laws, and the SAVE Act. So, what are these things? 15th Amendment is the amendment to the United States Constitution that confers the right to vote to all U.S. citizens. This is a really big amendment because it was ratified in 1870 during the Reconstruction era as a means to guarantee that Black men, especially formerly enslaved people, had the legal right to vote. And voter ID laws are rules that require a person to show identification before they can vote in an election. 36 states have laws requiring or requesting voters to show some form of identification at the poll, and the remaining 14 states and Washington, D.C. use other methods for verification of identity, such as a signature is checked against information on file. And then our final vocab, what is the SAVE Act? So you may have heard Trump already talking about this a lot, but the SAVE Act is the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, and it requires voters to provide documents of proof of citizenship at the time of registration and a photo ID at the time of voting. It would also place many restrictions on mail-in ballot voting, and this has been a hallmark of Trump for a long time. Let's not forget that he is still alleging that there was voter fraud in the 2020 election. So this has been a thorn in his side for a really long time. So that's an issue.
That has been a long assertment of this administration, even though they've been proven many of times that is not factually true. And what's interesting is when we peel back this issue around election security and integrity and voting access goes even further back. Like Casey was talking about, the right to vote comes from the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. And the historical context behind that is that following the Civil War, many enslaved people were being discriminated against on the basis of race and not allowed to vote. And so what they did is they passed the 15th Amendment. And still, after the passage of the 15th Amendment, many states continue to use tactics like literacy tests, poll tax, and intimidation to prevent Black people from voting. And these barriers were addressed later during the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. However, flash forward today, we still see voter ID acts like the SAVE Act and many other tactics and strategies that are used to suppress people from voting. And so what's going on in the current administration and the current landscape of Congress is that the House has passed the SAVE Act already. Earlier this year, it passed. Now, Trump has put a tremendous amount of pressure on the Senate to pass it. He called them out during the State of the Union address, and he has been on record saying, I will not pass or sign any other legislation until the SAVE Act is passed. And right now, a lot of analysts are saying that the SAVE Act does not have a bright future, and it is very unlikely to become law. And that is because in the Senate, you need a 2/3 majority to pass it, meaning the Republicans would need Democrats. And the Democrats are unified in saying they do not support this bill, which is super interesting. We'll get into this in the talks, but essentially there is some bipartisanship agreement that only U.S. citizens should be voting in elections. But long story short, Democrats don't support this bill. It's probably not going to become law, but that is where things stand.
I find it interesting too because I live in New York, and in New York, we don't need to show ID. So I only ever had to verify my signature. And
Yeah.
I think it does raise some potential concerns. But I also want to note here that this administration is also alleging that Democrats have used this to rig elections and that we have an abundance of illegal immigrants who are voting in their elections, which both have been proven to be untrue. So it does feel like at that point it gets a little discriminatory as well.
Definitely. I feel like it's so funny you mentioned having your signature to vote because my earliest memories of elections and voting is actually going with my parents to the polls. My mom would always take me with her whenever she went to vote. And so I would stand in the lines with her and I would watch her sign her name. It's just a clear and distinct memory I had. And then we would go into like the booth and you would pull the curtain back and press the different buttons on the machines. And I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. So even at a young age, I was very interested in the elections. And then flash forward when I was first of voting age, I was a resident of New Jersey. And so that's my first voting experience was. And I remember again, like signing the thing and going into the booth and people are poking holes in the whole signing, right? Like, how is that proof? And what happens is they actually refer back to that to verify your identification and everything. And I do feel like that is enough because why would you need to show a passport to vote?
Yeah.
Like, I don't understand how that's necessary. But I think it is this fear mongering that all these quote unquote illegal people are here rigging elections. But research has shown that's not actually what's happening.
Exactly. And I also can attest that there are so many people who have the right to vote who don't. So I think it's also a combination of lack of proper information, which is every day in America. We're not getting the proper information, but also people who are illegal in this country are not trying to bring attention to that, especially now. So I find it very hard to believe that they're running to the polls when we can't even get some actual citizens to be running to the polls. So that's one thing.
Yeah.
I also went to the polls with my mother because you don't have school on election
Oh,
day.
you had school day, you had election day off?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, maybe that's a Connecticut thing because I feel like I was in school.
Oh, no, I was,
Wait, did you guys do the elections in your class?
yes.
I
Yes.
remember doing that. I was like, I want to say I was in 3rd grade, but whatever year was the Bush Gore election,
Yeah.
I remember voting in school. Like, obviously, it didn't count. I was a child. Like the school elections.
No, schools are closed because that's where the voting happens. Voting
Okay.
would happen at elementary schools, high schools. That's where everyone would go to vote.
Oh,
So,
you're so lucky.
yeah, so we never had school on election day. And my mom would always take us to whatever her polling site was, and we would get behind the curtain and she would vote. And then we would get the stickers, and then my dad would have to do it after he came home from work, and we were always like, "Did you get your sticker?" But yes, that was my first memory of voting. And also in Connecticut, when I was 18 and able to vote for my first time for Obama, so I voted on campus. But as far as the SAVE Act goes, they don't have bipartisan support. And also, in order for this to really continue, they need to use the filibuster, no?
Yes, because they do not have Democratic support. The only way for them to circumvent the 2/3 majority that they would need is by ending the filibuster. And this has been like, I feel like this comes up every time there's like a high priority legislation for one party, but the Senate is in the way of doing that, is they say, let's end the filibuster. Okay, I'm so tired of this conversation. They're not going to end the filibuster. Does it suck? Yes, it does. But senators really like it because it gives them a lot of power. Okay. It gives them more control and more influence because each vote is so important. And it's okay if we end the filibuster now when we have the majority, but not the 2/3 majority we need. We have the simple majority. What's going to happen next
Right.
year when he has it, right? And like the people who are very institutionalist and very cognizant of that reality that power changes all the time in DC, they don't want to end the filibuster. And they're not going to end it for this bill. I don't see a future in which any version of the Senate, whether the Democrats have control or the Republicans have control, would end the filibuster. And that's a whole nother episode that where we can dissect the filibuster. Is it good? Is it bad? And if you want to see that episode, drop a comment. But I don't see it happening now, and the SAVE Act is not going to pass.
Agree. I agree. Let's talk about it though as legislation. And Mac, I think you're the one to really chime in here. Is this good legislation? Is it bad? What's the vibe check?
Yes, I think that it is bad legislation, and this is why. A lot of researchers are saying that this would have a disproportionate impact on people who don't have proper identification and people who are going through name changes. So, who are those people? One, those are low income communities. A lot of lower income people and families, they don't have the IDs or the birth certificates, right? It gets passed around when they move a lot, right? So a lot of times low income people, they have a higher propensity of moving. And so when you move from one house to another, sometimes things get lost, sometimes things get moved, and you don't know exactly where your birth certificate is. You don't know exactly where the documentation is that you need to go to the DMV. Also, you don't have a lot of time on your hands when you're working a low wage job, or you don't have the flexibility in that job to go to the DMV and wait in the lines to get the photo identification that you need. The other group of people that they're saying could be harmed by this are women. And why is that? The patriarchy. It's not funny, but in our society, one of the common traditions is when you get married, the woman changes her surname to her husband's last name. And then you have to, I've not gone through this process, but I know friends who have, right? You have to do a ton of paperwork to legally change your last name when you get married. And so they're saying this would harm women. And so for those reasons, I feel like it would have a disproportionate impact on those two groups and really disenfranchise people who have already have a long history of suffrage and disenfranchisement in this country. We talked about the 15th Amendment in the context of formerly enslaved people and Black people, but also women have not always had the right to vote in this country. Hello. Like, we need all the protection we can get, not barriers preventing us from voting.
Exactly. I think that this mission of theirs is just so obvious, like so many things that they try to push through. And you have to be able to have discernment and really read between the lines because they're going to distract and detract with any rhetoric that they can. That is the whole MO of this administration. And so when you get to the nuts and bolts of what the SAVE Act could really do in a really harmful way, it is going to stop people from voting and prevent, and maybe not stop, but for sure present some barriers. And let's face it, everyone is way too busy. Whether or not, I don't care what kind of job you have, nobody wants to go wait at the DMV. Nobody wants to do all these jump through hoops to even change their name. I know a lot of my friends who have gotten married who just waited to change their name just for the fact of the barriers that already exist and how annoying it is to tie something like that to voting, which is a right that every US citizen should have and should have easy access to, is to me really shady. And you want to talk about fraud and you want to talk about stolen elections, that is step one, is creating barriers that make it difficult for people who fully should have the right to vote and now they don't. That is messed up.
Yeah. I think, yeah, this just isn't the solution that I think a lot of people think it is. I think it's more of a messaging. It's more of like the symbolism behind immigrants are bad. Voting fraud is rampant. The Democrats steal elections. I think it goes into that. But as far as what will work, Casey, what you were talking about earlier, the fact that in Connecticut they close schools is, I think, solutions that will help the voting access and election integrity in our country. And that is having election day being a holiday and people having, like I said, also low wage workers don't have a ton of flexibility when it comes to getting IDs, but also for voting, right? We have these long lines. When I voted in the last election, I did early voting. So that's another thing people should take advantage of. And that this administration is trying to stop is mail-in voting and early voting. And I took advantage of early voting and did not wait in line for more than 2 seconds. And so I think we need to push that more. And those are policy solutions that I think would help. What about you, Case? Do you feel like there are solutions or strategies that people should think about or policymakers should think about?
I think that when it comes to voting being a holiday, that should be a non-starter, but I also
Yeah.
think that would require a lot of buy-in from people that may just say no. I
Yeah.
think that's gets challenging because people who are working really intense jobs, I don't think that the corporations don't want them to vote, but if that's gonna be a real hindrance to getting to the polls, like, that becomes challenging. So what I think would be great, and I know that there are places that have done this too, is just extending poll times. Election day needs to be the whole day, and we need to make sure that it's staffed with poll workers well into the evening because ultimately you could be working a night shift or doing something that requires odd hours. And I think that's another way, especially when you talk about people who have been historically disenfranchised and or lower income communities where maybe they're working a double and allowing the
Right.
flexibility of hours to be really prioritized, especially just on election day. I also think that we have to double down on continuing to allow mail-in votes and early voting. I think that just extends the lifespan of being able to capture as many votes as possible. And ultimately, there are people who are hesitant to vote, and it will sometimes take a knock on the door from someone that they feel that they can trust to even get them to the polls. So I think we have to be also really sure that we have access to voter registration early and that people are always thinking about it. We should be really focused on making sure that everyone who's eligible to vote in this country is able to easily register and preventing those types of barriers. I asked you if I thought this was good legislation. I obviously don't think this is good legislation to provide more barriers when ultimately we still have a huge population of eligible voters who don't vote. And what we need to do is expand and educate, and that needs to be part of a broader approach to voting.
Totally agree. We said, I don't think the SAVE Act is going to wind up passing in the Senate. However, Donald Trump has suggested that he will try to advance certain provisions of it through other channels and other ways. So we will certainly be keeping our eyes and ears open and keeping you all updated on the future of the SAVE Act and some of its provisions. But what's going on currently, closing us out with our top line and T and three for this week, is some Senate confirmations and some primary news. So starting us off, Senator Markwayne Mullins from Oklahoma has advanced in his nomination process. Christine Nome for DHS Secretary. I think this is a really big item, an important item, because the first Trump 1.0 was infamous for its turnover. And in Trump 2.0, we saw that change a little bit. He wasn't as like doing the you're fired, you're fired. And so this was a big firing in Trump 2.0. And obviously, DHS and the ICE crackdowns have been in a lot of hot water and something we've been looking closely at. So it'll be interesting to see if this new leadership will come with any policy and implementation changes. Number two, Joe Kent, who was the National Counterterrorism Center Director, resigned earlier this week. He cited the war in Iran as the reason for his resignation. I think this is an important item to keep tracking because as we see the war and the conflict continue to go on, there's either going to be resignations or just a lot of fallout, right? Insider scoop. We hope to be covering this on an episode soon, but such a big item and a big fallout from what's going on right now. And the third item is congratulations to Juliana Stratton. She won her primary in Illinois for the Senate seat that Dick Durbin is retiring from, and a longtime senator from Illinois. And Juliana Stratton is the deputy governor. And so she had the backing of J.B. Pritzker, but it was still a very tight race and people were not sure who's going to come out on top because you had current Congress people running for that office. And with her winning of the primary, she's on a glide path to now become the next senator of Illinois. And this would make her the sixth Black senator in United States history. So a lot of history there, a lot of precedent. Speaking of big shoes, Barack Obama was a former senator from Illinois and also the first woman senator to ever sit in Congress was also from Illinois.
Thanks. And thank you to our listeners. We're going to wrap on that note, but we always encourage you to get into our comments, get into our DMs, follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and we will see you next time.